think is a peculiarity of Giorgio Bassani. All his works, his novel and his short story, put together, form really a novel. Why? You know, for Aristotle, a Greek tragedy, to be a Greek tragedy, has to have unity of time, of place, and of action. And I think that for a novel is the same rule, more or less. And there is a unity of place in this book, yes, because it's the Novel of Ferrara, because all the works of Giorgio Bassani are based in Ferrara. And not because Bassani lived all his life in Ferrara, because at a certain point he went to Rome and stayed in Rome more than the year he passed in Ferrara. But all his works are based there. So this unity is real. The second, unity of time. All the works of Giorgio Bassani are happen in the time of a fascism, from the 30s until the end of the Second World War, with an exception, the Heron, one of these masterpieces, but the Heron is in 1947, I think, 1947, and so the story is strongly related to the Second World War and to the other part of the Jewish life and persecution in Ferrara. So I think there is also unity of time, unity of action. In a certain way, it's impossible because you have different characters, different stories, different situations. But again, I think that the topic of the books of Bassani is the life and death of the Jewish community in Ferrara. And so, for this reason, I think that this is a novel. And from this point of view, I think that Bassani is unique, because I don't know a writer who could be considered as an author of only one novel. Obviously, any author, writer around an obsession or two, and as we say sometimes, he wrote all the time the same novel, but the book in the end are very different one from another. In the case of Bassani, I think that it is true that his work is an whole. And this is the first thing I want to say. The second, Bassani is an author of memory. All his writing is based on memory. Why? You know, we could see the depth of field because we have two eyes. If we have only one, all the images would be flat. I think that for a writer, the depth of field is given also for a writer because there are two different points of view. In the case of Bassani, one is the point of view of the characters inside the story, And the other is the point of view of the narrator, because the narrator tells the story every time, 10 or 20 years after the story happened. And this is central in the work of Giorgio Bassani. And at the beginning of the book, the epigraph is a quote by Alessandro Manzoni, and it says, "Of course, for whoever pays heed to it, the heart always has something to say about what's to come. But what does the heart know? Just the least bit about what has happened already." That means that the narrator could tell a story that he knows because he arrives many years after the story. Also, when the narrator is one of the characters of the story, because he's a completely different person who knows things that the narrator inside the story doesn't know. In this sense, I think that Bassani is very near to Proust. As the same relation, try to give another life to a word that is dead. In the case of Proust, it's dead because of the passing of time. In the case of Bassani, it's for the passing of time, but also for history, because the people who it tries to make living again were killed during the Second World War. Last thing that I want to say, and then I leave the floor to my friends, is about the style, because and the language of Bassani. Because André once asked me how I think about the style of Bassani. I have to make a premise. In Italy, until the television era, there wasn't a basic Italian, a language spoken by all the people in their day-by-day life, because people spoke dialects, with the exception of Tuscany. But it's not because no, what is not? It's Italian, yes.
It is what Tuscan people think and say.
Yeah.
In their own peculiar way.
Yes. Okay, because the Italian was only the language of bureaucracy, the language of written culture, but not the language who people spoke. And that's the reason why no writer has had a natural language. Every writer has to look for a language that he had to build by himself. Now, starting with Alessandro Manzoni, who said, "I'm going to wash my clothes in Arno." It means I have to go to Florence to listen to the Italian, to the sound, to the rhythm of the speaking Italian. And so it's for Giorgio Bassani, because the first generation who has the Italian like the normal language was mine, because television started at the middle of the 50s, and after 10 years, 15 years, all the Italian understand the same language, the same standard language, basic language that television used. Giorgio Bassani has to build his language. So it's not natural. And I would like to make an example, very brief, to make you understand how he worked on the language. Particularly in his short stories, because short stories were the first things he wrote. And so he came and write and rewrite many times this short story. And I will read the starting phrase of his first short story. The title in his first publication on 1953 was Storia d'amore, love story. And this is the start. Also, the people who doesn't know Italian, I think that could listen to the sound, to the rhythm of this phrase. Finché visse, Deborah Beatty ricordò sempre il breve periodo di tempo che aveva preceduto il parto. Very plain, very short. Okay. After 20 years, this is the start of this short story. Also, the name of the protagonist is changed. But riandando agli anni lontani della sua giovinezza, sempre, finché visse, lì da Mantovani, ricordò con vivezza il momento del parto e ancor più i giorni che l'avevano immediatamente preceduto. It's completely different. Is I don't know. You have to use a long breath to read it. It's a beautiful language. It's richer than the start. It's a conquest for him to arrive at this language. And I think that the language of Giorgio Bassani is one of the most important and interesting language in the Italian literature history of the 20th century. And this solved for me. I don't know which is going to speak.
Well, we're not going to
Judith.
lecture. We're going to
Okay.
converse because it's more lively.
May I introduce you?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Judith Thurman began his career as a translator and has written essays about artists and writers, many of which are collected in Cleopatra's Nose, 39 Varieties of Desire. She began contributing to the New Yorker in the late 80s and became a staff writer in 2000. She writes about books, culture, and fashion. Her story on Yves Saint Laurent was chosen for the best American essays on 2003. She is the author of Isaac Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, and Cigarettes of the Flesh, A Life of Colette, the winner of the Los Angeles Time Book Award for Biography. Please, Judith Thurman.
Well, we thought we would converse because it just seems like a livelier way to approach Bassani. I have a personal, just to start off with, when André invited me to join him tonight, I said yes I like doing gigs with André. We do a lot. We're a sort of a little team. But the first thing that I ever published as a critic, strangely, in London, I was about 22, was a review of Behind the Door by Giorgio Bassani. I don't remember reading it. I don't remember what I wrote. It's certainly not online anywhere. It was way before online meant anything but something hanging from a clothesline. And but I had this. I was deep into the prose of Bassani, and I was living in Rome before that, and I went to see the Garden of the Finzi-Continis when it came out, and was completely beguiled, and began reading Bassani in Italian later. But my Italian, he's as you said, he's very challenging in Italian. Great writing always is challenging because in mediocre writing you can guess what a word means from its context, and a great writer shakes things up to such a degree that you can't you can't guess. You have to, you actually have to know the words. You have to know the grammar. So he's a beautiful and a challenging writer. And I don't know. My impression, I got this enormous and beautiful book with all of these stories in one place, and my first experience of it, I don't know about what yours was a very exciting kind of claustrophobia.
Well, because I love this book. I think it's absolutely stunning to get an Italian writer who died about how many years ago? 2000?
2000, yeah.
Yeah, so
15 years ago.
And suddenly to have
18 years ago.
his collected works, or more or less, in one volume, retranslated, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and I'm very happy to see it. I'm not a Bassani expert by any means, so do not get me wrong, but I read, there was a period in my life when I was reading many novels that I was not supposed to read, because I never read contemporary fiction. I don't read 20th century fiction, more or less. But I went through a period where I was reading all the Italian writers, Pratolini, Cassola, Levi, all of them. Moravia, of course, I devoured. And the last one I read was Bassani, because I knew he was the most difficult. And he is the most difficult because his sentences are not those clipped Italian sentences that you find in most, like Pratolini's sentences are short. They're sort of simple sentences, whereas he's struggling with language. And you said something very right, which I believe is totally true of all great writers. Whether it's on television or not, it's a great writer usually reinvents the language. In other words, the language is never left the same as it was before the writer wrote. Yes, Manzoni started this in Florence when he realized, was it his granddaughter who told him that he doesn't speak Italian well, or was it?
Yeah, they speak French at home.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so his Italian he knew there was something wrong with his Italian. And so he decided, okay, I've got to write Florentine Italian or do some imitation of Florentine. And this is the same thing with Bassani, where you have a sense that it's the language that is, it's the same thing is true of Dante. The language is reinvented from almost scratch. You reinvent the language. And I don't know that we do the same thing in America, where you...
No, because we're monolingual. I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker about hyperpolyglots, people who speak more than 11 languages. And in the course of this, Americans and Anglo-Saxons in general are the exceptions rather than the rule in the world, where most people are multilingual. People speaking 3, 4, 5 languages, that's not a feat, it's not special. People just do. They come from places that are crossroads of culture. And Italy was such a crossroads with all of the dialects and all of the kids learning Latin and Greek in school, the kids who went to the Liceo. So there was this potpourri stew of languages that they were hearing, and the household help would come from someplace, or the South, and then the old relative would show up as the Venetians show up here. So it was a very, very living, informal, changeable linguistic atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And the fact is that I think dialects, there are people who will claim that they never spoke the dialect. Especially, you see these people in New York, especially when they come from the South and let's say they belong to a certain class of people that is wealthy. They will never tell you that they spoke Neapolitan at home. That they only spoke it with the help. But it is true that dialects are very alive, and people hear songs in dialect, for example. All the songs are in dialect. They're never in the language of Italian, and so on. So you have a sense, and I particularly like the idea. You said two things that really fascinate me. One is that he didn't just polish his Italian, he reinvented it. And the second one is that he's always writing about a place that he had stopped living in altogether. In other words, and I was just reading a book, The Life of Adler, the German writer who ended up in Theresienstadt and then survived and lived in London for the rest of his life. He's always writing about Prague. And Joyce does the same thing. He's always writing about Dublin. He's never, I mean, he went back to Dublin, I think, very, very few times, if only once, I think, and never went again. And so you have a sense of these people who are focused on a period of their lives, on a city that they have completely sort of set aside. And all they do is they revisit it time and time and time again.
But that's such a widespread phenomenon in fiction. If you think of Faulkner, he wasn't going back to Mississippi. He was living in Hollywood. Or Philip Roth with Newark. He would go there occasionally to visit his parents' graves, but he wasn't hanging out in Newark. It's the recovery, the effort to recover that visceral experience that you lived as a child, that you lived in your formative years, that is connected to a place. Because the hero, or the heroine, I should say, of this romanzo is the city of Ferrara. It's not the characters, it's the city itself and the city's architecture and the body of the city, the winding paths and the parks and this enclosed, you have, the reason that I said an exciting claustrophobia, you have this sense of enclosure, which is also the enclosure of time, the enclosure of this place which is enclosed and it has been ended. And of course also the experience of the Jewish community of Ferrara has been enclosed and ended. So it's extremely visceral. But I was wondering, I wanted to ask you both, if you don't think that the change in style, because it strikes the late Bassani is so Proustian. Now, don't you think he had, in the interim, had absorbed just tons and tons of Proust, had discovered Proust and sort of...
Took pills of Proust.
Took Proust pills. Yeah.
I'm sure he must have, but he must have read Proust when he was also much younger. I mean, this was a very cultivated man. He had read everything. And he was also, I mean, he was a musician. He was also interested in the arts and in literature. So there was no doubt that he had read Proust when he was quite young. But of course, you can read Proust when you're very young. It doesn't mean that you become Proustian.
No.
That's something that happens when you sort of cultivate your memory a bit, and then you realize, oh, maybe I could become Proust too. But
there is that stage.
His sentences just suddenly sort of, and I'm going to read a passage from the English translation, if I may, at some point, where you can get a sense that, maybe I'll read it now. Is that okay?
The translation, for what I can say, it's beautiful. Yeah.
Yes, well, I'm going to read something. This is at the end of the story of the Heron, or the L'airone, and I'm going to read it in English because you get a sense of how it works. He's saying goodnight to his mother, and she's in bed, and he's, of course, a grown man. He has a wife in the next room, and he's decided to do something with his life, which I will not give away, but you can take a guess what it is. And so he leaned down to kiss her on the forehead. "Bye," he said. "Good night." "Yes, my dear, good night to you as well." He turned his back to her, crossed the room, and reached the door. And now, with his hand on the latch, he turned to look at her, surrounded by everything that was most her own and most dear to her. The little adoring dog, almost touching her, then the family photographs, the heraldic arms of the House of Savoy on parchment in a silver frame, the many-colored vials of medicine, the leather spectacles, the tiny golden parallel piped of her zenith alarm clock, the books on the one bookcase, the last few years' issues of Via d'Italia on another, the Giornale dell'Emilia open on the green damask quilt level with the little bundle of black fur that was Lila, and so on and on. She gave him a warm smile. White down there, right, wrapped in her cocoon of light. "Good night," he repeated. "Good night, my dear Edgardo." You have a sense of what kind of writing is this? This is absolutely stunning. This is beautiful. And it's all filled with sort of crappy little details, okay? They're not important, but he just needs to list everything to you so that he creates a rhythm, so that he can finally come back and say good night again.
And they're saturated with, as this entire volume is saturated with a sense of loss.
Yes.
That's so moving, and that's not sentimental. If it were sentimental, it wouldn't be good, and it isn't. But it's a book of mourning in a way. It's a Kaddish, and yet it doesn't descend into melancholy. There's melancholy moments, but it relishes, this is the old mother saying goodnight to the old mother in this stuffy room and filled with old strange things, that heirlooms and relics and things that she has clung to. He doesn't cling, and yet he manages to celebrate and to imbue this world with that sense of loss.
Yeah, I think everything he writes is about loss,
Yeah.
or anticipated loss, or loss that has happened, or that might happen, and it's always, and so you have this sense that nothing is ever present for him. I mean, he describes this city as if it's a map of a city that has already been, that hasn't been excavated yet. It's been buried, and it's gone. And so he's trying to recreate it in his words. And you wonder why.
Exhumed, I think.
It's exhumed, yes, it is, yes. But you wonder why he is doing that. All he had, I mean, it's strange because all he could have done was just take the train from Rome to Ferrara. It's not more than, what, 3 hours?
The time, I think, more, but okay.
Okay, fine. Then you could have gone by car, you know? Okay. But basically, it's an easy thing. You want to go back to the city, but it's not just the city. It's the people in the city. It's the time of the city. And so the Ferrara that he wants doesn't exist anymore. It's not on the map. So he has to rebuild it. And what is strange, or not strange, is that he's constantly going back there. And he's constantly, as if he's exhumed it in one book, and then, okay, it's done, it's on paper now, but then it goes away again, so he has to rewrite it again, which is why we say that he has really written one book. But then if you think of any author, how many books do they write, really? It's always one book.
Yeah, it's one. Proust wrote one book.
Yeah, so Proust did. Right. Good example.
But
okay.
but and in the Italian, the romanzo is actually better than novel. It's a much better word than novel. There's no actual translation. You can't.
No.
It's like the Romance of the Rose. It's like a chivalrous romance. And it has that scent of loss and antiquity. But at the end, I think it's in Scent of Hay. There's a description of going to the Etruscan tombs at Cerveteri.
Oh.
And what you just read about the bedroom of his mother is almost an exact echo of his description of going to visit the tombs in Cerveteri with his family. They stop, they turn off the road, and it's a Sunday, and people are visiting the tombs. And he imagines the Etruscans going to visit their tombs, which are ready for them. That they're waiting. The funeral bed has been laid out, and he talks about all of the delightful little things that are going to be entombed with them, which might be, the little dog, probably not, but the book and the glasses and all that they were. And it's the same scene. It's quite extraordinary.
But I think he does it because, I mean, my thinking is that he does it because of style. Just you load up anything you can in that sentence. You make it long. You create a rhythm, particularly. And I think the rhythm is adhered to very ably in this translation. And you put stuff, anything could be, just put anything you want. And just put it on hold because you still are waiting for the end of the sentence to come. And it's really good night, Mom. And we're talking about Proust. It's the boy going to say good night to his mother, which is...
Or waiting for the mother to come and give him a kiss.
Yes.
Yeah.
So...
Well, one incredibly endearing thing about Bassani to me is that he suffered so much. And I suffer, I'm not comparing myself, but I suffer a lot when I write it ridiculously. It's really too exorbitant. And he was not one of those writers who just poured out his prose. This is deceptively thick, this book. It was like pulling teeth for him, and he describes at the end how hard because he was a poet, and so you can get through the end of the tunnel in a piece of work. Is a measure of the anxiety you feel going into it. If you can see the light at the end, you can see the light at the end of a poem usually, but you can't see the light at the end of a novella. And he says, even the stroll before dinner cost me an enormous struggle. I began to write it toward the end of 1948, and I worked over it for more than 2 years. I had scribbled down a page, the opening one, then came to a halt. I felt I had in hand a strong opening, infinitely rich in promise and suggestion, but where on earth this tortuous little lane I'd taken would lead me, I had no idea. And then he goes on to say, what a struggle, what a painful battle. So the struggle, the claustrophobia that he produces so sensuously, so evocatively, was also his experience of being locked in a room and trying to write. And he tried to escape. He was always, someone said, you have to stop going so much on your bicycle in Rome. You have to stay and sit in front of a desk. And that was also part of his apprenticeship as a writer, was chaining himself to the desk.
Isn't that what Alfieri used to have done to him?
Yeah.
To be tied to
Yeah.
to his desk.
Yeah.
It's something that happens to some writers. You know, they have to be tied. Some others, you wish they went biking and stopped biking.
Exactly.
The other subject that we should discuss a tiny bit, because it perplexes me. It's the question, of course, the Holocaust. It's staring at you. And on the other hand, when you look at the occhiali, what is it?
The
Occhiali-
gold rimmed glasses.
the golden glass, yes. It's not about the Holocaust. But it is about the Holocaust. Everything ends up being about the Holocaust, because I think his characters are all, I think all of them are misplaced. In other words, they're not really at home, ever, which is strange, because you would think that somebody who's constantly going back to Ferrara on paper would be sort of housed in Ferrara at some point. And I don't think he ever felt at home in Ferrara. In other words, I think he was already displaced, even when he was living in Ferrara. He didn't feel comfortable in his own skin. And you have all these characters who don't have to be Jewish, but they are, in one way or another, persecuted.
Well, they're doomed. He's writing about doomed
Yeah,
people. The
right.
Jews are doomed, and so many of the other characters, you're doomed by age. You're doomed by the failure of your promises. You're doomed by all kinds of things. But I think what struck me about reading this book now is this evocation of a moment just before
Yeah.
the apocalypse. And I don't know, many of you perhaps feel that there's a similarity between these times and a period in Europe with the rise of nationalism, fascism, um, uh, the undermining of civil liberties, and the attacks on minorities. And it's kind of an uncanny feeling to read this book in 2018, and to see the complacency of these assimilated Jews who felt really the way American Jews, my family, felt, can't happen here. They joined the fascist party before Mussolini made his pact with Hitler. So there's that sense of complacency. Also, it's like a fog. He captures that so well. That's part of his genius. These people, they don't see it coming. They don't see it coming till it is upon them. They're part of the system. And at first everything's normal. The neighbors, they're not in ghettos. They're assimilated. They're Christian neighbors. They're friends with them. They all go on holidays together. But the creeping loss of dignity and freedom and rights that then ceases to creep and explodes. That's
This
very
is-
much part of this.
This is very important. We published 2 years ago a book by Bassani with 2 conversations he had here at the Institute. And one of his answer was very interesting, because he said that for him was easier to leave after the racial laws, because he was anti-fascist. So a persecution against him is something that for him could be understood, because he was against fascists, and fascists were against him. But for many Jews that were fascists, like many of Italians, almost in a certain period, almost all the Italians, was completely different situation, because they didn't wait for this, and they didn't understand it. And this is also the reason why they were not able to face the situation, no? Like the Finzi-Continis absolutely clear. The story of Finzi-Continis, is like the heart. You don't know. You can't forecast the future. No, you could know something of the past, but you can't forecast the future. And this is the. I think that in the work of Giorgio Bassani, he wrote many beautiful books. The Heron for me is a masterpiece, but the Garden of Finzi-Continis is at the center of this work, and is at the center also of this book. But I think it's not for Keates. No?
Yeah, no. I think that the Garden of the Finzi-Continis is, in fact, it's all of Bassani is in there. I would say a lot of it is in there. The irony is that Bassani finished his dissertation when the racial laws were being applied. So he stayed in Italy, did he stay? He stayed in Italy. He got married in Italy, he changed his name, lived in Florence for a while.
He lived in Paris for a while.
Yes, but during the war?
No, after.
After, yeah.
He went to prison. And then,
he did, yes.
Briefly.
But then he was released. And so there was, he never left Italy. He could have left Italy. In the film, I remember, Giorgio leaves and goes to Paris. I don't know if in the book it's. I don't see what happens when you see a movie and you have the book, you forget the book. Right. Okay.
But the way that
Giorgio Bassani didn't like the movie.
I know. Yes, he
didn't
hated
like the
it.
movie. No. But the way that these people are shell shocked. You read stories about this in the news all the time about a community in which you felt safe suddenly turning against you. That was the experience of the Jews of Ferrara, and that's the experience you read about it. The black man who's shot in his house by a neighbor who doesn't think he should be there, or the woman who's just these stories of something has been let out of its cage. Something horrible has been let out of its cage, and that's what he captures in so many of these vignettes of life, of the moment of the vicious beast being let out of the cage.
But then he does something also which is equally ugly, are the Jews who witnessed, or the people who have witnessed a murder and will not rat or denounce the person that they see in the street as being the murderer. So there's a kind of...
it's a corruption. What takes place is a corruption that feels all too familiar.
That's true. We don't denounce people who commit murders, no.
Okay,
we should open.
There's something, question from the public, please.
I don't know what the reason is. I have no idea what the reason is. I can only speculate.
I think it's only a question of work, because he started to work in the publishing world, and Rome is a better place than Ferrara to work. And
maybe he didn't want. No, maybe he didn't want his Ferrara to be challenged by the real Ferrara. And it's possible, just like you don't want to see. In Flaubert's Sentimental Education, he doesn't really want to see Madame Arnoux as an old woman. He wants to remember her the way she was. So there may be something, the beloved Ferrara, maybe he didn't want to revisit her.
Another question?
I am perplexed by what you have been saying. I read Bassani from 1959 to 1961 and chose Bassani over other writers in second and third year Italian in college. And it's because I found, and the students found, that he was a pellucid writer. There was nothing between the lines, at least it seemed to me and to my students, and no allusions. Everything was named properly. Now, is it because we were reading his first versions, while you are referring to the later versions of his writings?
You're asking me?
Well, whoever, you're the expert.
I don't know. I would suspect that because I have two editions of the Ferrara stories. And as I was looking at the translation, I was perplexed because I couldn't find the exact equivalent, but then I found the edition. The earlier edition I'm not really familiar with, but I'm sure that this is what you were reading, or the earlier version, because the Italian is simpler. It is simpler. There's no question that this is not easy Italian, and you can see from the example that Giorgio read, the Italian is certainly, it's not stilted, but it's elegant, it's graceful, it's.
Yes, also because the Giardino Finzi-Continis was published in 1962, so after your reading, and the short stories are rewritten, were rewritten many times, because the first edition, La passeggiata prima di cena, was published in 1953. Then there was another edition with the title of Cinque Storie Ferraresi, and then the last one on 1968 is Dentro le Mura. And every time he rework a lot on the language. So the language, yes, changed very much from the beginning to the end. Of the short period of writing in narrative, because it started around the beginning of the 50s, and the Novel of Ferrara his last publication was in 1980, so it's not more than less than 30 years. It's not so much for a writer. But the language changed during this period, yeah.
I mean, can you imagine if Hemingway were to rewrite his books, what he would think of doing?
I think that is a very, well, I don't know, but in Italy, in the past, now when the writers could write a book, I don't know, 5 years after the novel before, because in the end, you see, it's a big volume, but it's all is writing. No, it's not so much. Now you have to publish a book every 2 years because the people forgot you, and it's very different. It's like also Alessandro Manzoni. He wrote not only a novel, but you know only one novel, I Promessi Sposi, and he wrote and rewrote and rewrote the same novel many times. I think that it's better than now, but it's just an opinion. Okay?
No, we have a fantastic example in L'Éducation sentimentale, where we have the first edition and then the last edition, and they're completely different. And but I think it's an old tradition where you keep going back to the book to fix it. And
to meddle with it sometimes.
Perfect, yeah. I mean, we should all do that, you know.
It was better also for the philologists, no? They have some work to do.
Yes, it's good for the critics. It keeps people employed. Yes,
Yes,
it's
true.
Yes.
I wonder if anybody who's read this book, the three of you, I did think of Elena Ferrante reading this. There's nothing in common. Their style, their characters, their tone of voice. She's not an elegiac writer, God only knows. But the place of Naples in her work as a visceral character, as a living creature, and the place of Ferrara in his. There is some correspondence there that struck me as I was rereading Bassani. And in fact, the minute she leaves Naples, the tetralogy loses something. It's not as interesting as when she's teaching in Pisa, wherever she goes, or Florence, and she's away from Naples. And Naples, the mixture of dialect and Italian, and the tension between Italian and dialect they're just similar things, but they're they're at the opposite poles of the Italian literary spectrum in many other ways.
Yeah. Yes, I think so.
Yeah. Yes, there.
What do Italians choose when they read Bassani? What do the Italians choose? Do they choose Bassani earlier or Bassani later?
Who do they choose? Italians, what do they prefer to read? The early Bassani or the later
Maybe this
Bassani?
gentleman would tell us. They prefer the early or the later? Yeah.
No, that's true. I repeat for the short story. The Garden of Finzi-Continis or the Heron is more or less the same in the different editions because it's, I think, from the beginning of the 60s that his language became so rich and complex and.
There's another reason why he may not have gone back. The Ferrarese were furious with him. He offended them, and he offended especially. There was a family, the Finzi-Continis are based on a family called the Finzi-Magrini, and they were furious at the way they and even relatives of his were furious with him. So there was quite a bit of outrage at the way they felt that he had used their stories and their lives and their narratives and their anecdotes. So maybe he was, thought he's not going to go back and face the music. It's possible.
Well, again, that's the case with James Joyce. He wrote Dubliners, and they never forgave him.
But they still live in Dubliners now.
And of course, they have Bloomsday every year, and it's a big event.
And now everything in Ferrara is Bassani flavored.
Some other questions?
Anybody else?
How many of you have read Bassani?
Bravi.
Okay, bravi.
Bravi. Oh, I've been carrying it around all day.
But, yeah.
My back is hurting. I have one problem.
But it's also so beautiful.
It is such a beautiful book.
But then, it's very hard.
Yeah,
it is very
It would have been nice to have some footnotes and back matter and the dates of the stories. It's with the French call an édition établie. It's sort of missing certain things.
But can you get the single story? Or now this? Well, first of all,
we are not the publisher.
I don't in Italian, obviously.
Okay. You could ask to the publisher. Yes.
Having said that, sort of.
Lots of copies of this book, and we can reissue the.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, André. Thank you, Judith.